In the last chapter, we focused on the self concept and how every interaction impacts who we are at any particular moment. There is this concept called the situational self, in which we do change from moment to moment, but we are relatively consistent from one time frame to another. It took a series of interactions to create who we are today, and that's what socialization is about. What are the processes that lead us to become the person we are today? And what is likely going to happen to us in the future? That's what we're going to look at this week in the Socialization over the Life course. Earlier in the semester, we talked about this internal dialogue called self-indication, this dialogue between the I and the me. But even this dialogue doesn't happen automatically. This requires a little bit of training. And Mean talked about 3 stages we go through before we can fully interact with ourselves and other people: the preparatory, play, and game stage. The preparatory stage is simply where children start collecting all the meanings that exists on all the objects and people around them. Not only what they technically mean, that is, they're by definition who they are or what they are, but all the feelings associated with those things as well. Is fire good or bad? Is a particular person or an ethnic group good or bad? All of these things are learned and absorbed by kids at a very early age. At some point, they transfer to the play stage. There's no exact age for this to happen, but at the play stage, children begin to make believe. They start playing roles from society. But obviously, young children are not doctors or mothers or whatever, but they play act them so they learn how to use those roles later in life. Then finally, at the game stage, 2 important things happen. One is children start to take on real roles for the first time. The second thing that's really important about this stage is that they have to interact with other people and coordinate. And that means they have to update and modify roles to meet particular needs in particular situations and people that they interact with. I want you to know these processes continue into your adulthood. I want you to think about this the next time you enter a new group, a new culture in any way, and see if you don't find yourself going through those 3 stages. We can't leave this topic without talking about The Looking Glass Self by Charles Horton Cooley. This is a very powerful idea, and I think something that will resonate with a lot of people. The Looking Glass Self is this idea that we see ourselves based on what we think other people think of us. We see ourselves based on, at least in part, what other people think of us. And it's called a mirror. Mirror is another way of looking glass. And if you know, the idea of a mirror is that it shows the opposite of our face. It's the inverse of it. And so it doesn't look exactly like what we look like. And same goes with people's opinion of us. Lots of research shows that people think very differently of us than we think they think of us. But still, we know one of the best predictors of self-esteem is what we think other people think of us. That's the reflected appraisal. We talked about that in the last chapter. So this idea of looking glass self is very, very poignant. Finally, I want to bring up the generalized other. The generalized other is like a composite understanding of what all society thinks about just about everything. If you've ever used the expression, well, most people think this or most people think that, you've got to ask yourself, where did you get this idea of most people? Yep, most of us have what we think of as most people, and that's the generalized other. Historically, people have studied children as little adults, that they're just being trained how to be adults and socialized as such. In the last 20 years or so, both in sociology and in other fields, we've started to look at children as a separate sort of subculture in and of themselves, called the sociology of childhood. Here we look at how children create cultural routines themselves. They have agency, stable activities, objects, and values that they share. But they also engage in what's called an interpretive reproduction of adult culture. And the research shows that they creatively adapt adult behaviors to fit their group's needs. And sometimes they have to modify their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to meet those group needs. As a result, in some cases, the larger adult culture is maintained. In other cases, it's modified, albeit a little bit, in order to meet the needs of that particular group, just like we do in the adult world. Recently, I started reading the book, The Odyssey. It's the story of Ulysses and his journey home and all the adventures that he has getting there. I'm going to try to convince you in the next few minutes that you are part of a great adventure. You are part of human history. There are 4 dimensions to life course sociology. The first is historical and social context, how historical events affect people born in the same birth cohorts, such as baby boomers or Gen Z. There's also timing, the incidence, duration, and sequence of roles and expectations based on age. When that timing is broken for some reason, then it's more likely to impact individuals. So when this happens, it's called a turning point. You expected to go to college, something else happened in the family, there's an economic downturn, whatever it is, it stopped that from happening. As a result, you go a different direction, hence a turning point. There's also linked lives. Our relationships are impact everything we do in life, as we've been talking about all semester. But as life events happen, historic events happen to us, we don't go through those things alone. And depending on what our network is like will determine how those events affect us. There was a movie called Life is Beautiful that came out in the 1990s, and it was about an Italian man who was sent to a concentration camp. But he smuggled in his small son and protected him not only physically from the Germans, but also mentally and emotionally. Clearly, that child experienced World War II very differently than a child who might have grown up in a different family during that time period. So let's apply the COVID pandemic to life course sociology. Clearly, the pandemic itself was an historic event to not just people in the United States, but the entire planet. It affected how a lot of young people experience college, hence the concept of timing. That is, college is a unique, specific time period for people. And for some people, that pandemic ruined their college experience. Some of them never went back to school as a result of it. And in some cases, the pandemic strengthened families. In other cases, it strained them significantly. The rates of disorder in families went up dramatically during the pandemic as people were forced to spend more time together than they're used to. And finally, agency clearly came out during the pandemic as some people were able to thrive in that environment. That is, they were able to make their way through the pandemic without a lot of problems, and other people suffered greatly. So life course sociology does a great job of trying to bring together all the different factors that explain how history impacts all of us and bringing us through that wave, but that we manage our way through the wave somewhat differently depending on all those factors that we just talked about. While socialization goes on in almost every single interaction we participate in, agents of socialization are incredibly powerful because they are the primary conduits through which societal norms and values are transmitted to individuals. Each agent plays a distinct yet interconnected role, contributing to our multifaceted self. Understanding how these agents operate helps us to analyze social patterns, such as class differences in child-rearing practices, or the pervasive influence of media and youth culture. It underscores the pervasive and constant nature of socialization throughout our lives. For instance, we know from a lot of research that middle-class families emphasize autonomy and individual development, while working-class families prioritize conformity and obedience, leading to obviously very different outcomes and values later in life for those children. Think about yourself for a second. Which agent of socialization, family, school, peers, or media, do you think had the most influence or impact on who you are today? Why? Socialization processes can happen in a split second. Group processes researchers examine how social statuses influence interactions within groups. Status characteristics theory highlights referential beliefs, commonly held beliefs about the relationship between different status characteristics, especially race, class, and gender, and reward levels in those groups. These beliefs are generally considered learned through socialization. This theory helps explain how socialization can inadvertently lead to prejudice and lower expectations, which in turn lead to lower performance. Experiments have even shown that people arbitrarily deemed high status in a group may perform better on tasks than people labeled as low status in groups. We both bring in perceptions from the larger society into everyday interactions, but we recreate those in the interactions themselves. To truly understand the self in sociology, we must embrace its ongoing, multifaceted nature. It's not a finished product, but a continuous process of learning, adapting, and responding to our ever-changing social world. In many ways, we really are riding this wave of history, but we're not doing it alone. There's a lot of other people around us. The real question is, what are we going to do with that wave that's been given to us? How are we going to work with the people who are riding that wave with us to create the best possible outcome?